All right. So we're going to continue on from where we left off with 1.3. So we're going to be finding the missing endpoint, right? Now we did the first one the first way here, okay? We did that first one the first way here, okay? And we said our midpoint formula, this is a review, our midpoint formula for x's was we took x1 and we took x2, we added them together and divided by 2. And that gave us the x of our midpoint. That gave us the x of our midpoint, okay? I'm just going to say xm, m for midpoint, okay? So first x, so first endpoint, second endpoint, midpoint. And so we said, okay, well, if we know this is the midpoint, I can do, and this is the endpoint, I can say -5 plus whatever our other endpoint is, which we don't know, so we'll call it x2, divided by 2, is going to be equal to whatever the midpoint value for the x is, which was -2, because this is our midpoint. Then we went through and solved this equation, and we said, okay, in order to solve, we have to multiply by 2. Because what's going to happen is a 2, or you can think of it as 2 over 1. They're the same thing. This 2 and this 2 over here will simplify to 1. And so we're just going to be left with -5 plus x2 equals -2 times 2, -4. That got rid of our fraction for us, okay? So that got rid of our fraction for us in this equation. So that way we can continue solving here by adding 5. Then we added 5 and said, okay, x2 is equal to 1. Okay? So we know for our other endpoint g, because EG is a segment, so for g, we know the x value is 1. We still have to find the y value, but now we know the x value. So we went through and we said, okay, if we do the same exact thing for the y's and say, okay, well, y1 plus y2 over 2 gave us the midpoint, gave us the y value of the midpoint. We just did that in our warm-up, right? Where we added the two y values from the endpoints, y1 and y2, divided by 2, and we got our midpoint y. Same idea, but here, we just don't know our y2. So we know the midpoint, and we know y1. So we say 4 plus whatever our other y value is, divided by 2, is going to be equal to 5, the y value of our midpoint. And we'll solve this as well. Okay, so we're going to multiply by 2, or 2 over 1, if we prefer. Those 2 simplify out, and we get 4 plus y2 equals 5 times 2 is 10. Solve for y2, we have to subtract this 4 that's being added with it. And we're left with y2 equals 6. So we know this points at 1, 6. We know this points at 1, 6. Now, if we look at this, the midpoint should be halfway between the two endpoints, right? So for the y values, 4 and 6, what's halfway between 4 and 6? 5, and that's the midpoint, okay? -5 and 1, what's going to be halfway between those two? -2, because -2 is 3 away from -5, and this 3 away from 1. So it ends up being halfway away from both of them, okay? This is what we talked about last class, didn't we? This was at the very end. It's pretty rushed, wasn't it? Okay. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to do a second way as well. I think you guys are going to prefer this way, but this only works when you have a graph, okay? It only works when you have a graph, okay? So you guys notice how I just did this kind of thing where I counted through, I counted how far away they were, and said the midpoint has to be halfway between them. It's that same idea. I'm going to graph my points. So I'm going to graph -5, 4, okay? And I'm going to call this point E. So ignore the light blue right now. Ignore this light blue. We're just looking at the red. And then I'm going to graph my midpoint, -2, 5, and it says that's point P, so I'm going to label it. Now, if my endpoint is on the left, my midpoint's a little bit to the right, which direction am I going to go to get to my other endpoint?
The right.
The right, because the midpoint has to be between them, right? So the endpoint has to be over here. It can't be over here, because then the midpoint's not between them, and then it wouldn't be a midpoint, would it? It wouldn't be in the middle.
No.
So we can say, how far to the right did we go from E to P, from our endpoint to our midpoint? So we can say I went 1, 2, 3 to the right. So we're going to have to go the same distance to the right in order to get from P to our other endpoint. We're going to go 1, 2, 3 to the right. So we know we're going to have an x value of 1, which is what we have. And I went up how many from E to P?
1.
1. So I'm going to go up 1 from P to our endpoint. G. And so we can say, okay, if I went over 3, up 1, similar to like slope, right? When we counted rise over run, I went up 1 over 3. Same idea. Up 1 over 3 more, and now P's in the middle, exactly. And I know my G's at 1, 6, which is what it is. Raise your hand if you liked that method more. Okay? Lower your hands. Raise your hand if you liked the first method more. Raise your hand if you didn't vote.
I didn't vote.
Yeah, there's a lot more people that didn't vote here, okay? Anyway, so this is the same idea as what I just kind of did through counting here and said, okay, well, to go from 4 to 5, I went up 1. So I'm going to have to go up 1 more from 5 to 6. To go from -5 to -2, I had to go up 3. So I'm going to have to go up 3 more, to the right 3 more, to -2 to 1. Same idea here, okay? On letter B, I actually want you guys to try letter B. And we have a graph here, okay? So you guys can do that same method where we graph it. Or if you really want, you can do this the first way as well, where we went through and did that math, okay? So you guys try letter B here. And find the other endpoint, given that P is the midpoint and E is an endpoint, okay? So go ahead and work on letter B.
Where says this has one?
I'm not sure.
Oh, Miss Ardell.
Oh, sorry.
I'm wondering if this.
I've joked about it before, but I wouldn't do that. Yeah, Alright, let's talk about this one up here a bit. So, if I plot these points, I have P at 1, 2. I have P at 1, 2. I have E is an elephant at -2, 2. Now it's important for me to know which one is the endpoint and which one's the midpoint. How do we know?
E and P.
Okay, E and P, but those are the 2 points. Which one's endpoint, which one's midpoint? How do we know? Ray.
P's midpoint.
Okay, how do we know that?
Because it says P. On B it says P. Like, yeah, that's the P.
Okay, up here is for the instructions. It says if P is the midpoint. So we know P is the midpoint. It says so in the instructions, okay? It's helpful to read the instructions, right? Okay, it really is. So P is the midpoint. That means E is the other endpoint. So where will the other endpoint be? Will it be over here on the right or on the left?
Right.
It'll be on the right. Because it has to go midpoint between the two. So how far up or down did I go from E to P?
3.
How up or down I went 3?
No, to the right you went 3.
I went to the right 3. Did I go up or down at all?
No.
No, so I'm just going to have to go to the right 3, up or down, not at all. And that's where G is. So I'm going to say G is at 4, comma 2. I found my missing endpoint. Okay? And we could walk through this the same, or if we, before I do that, any questions on how we did this? Schroeder.
Is there another way to do the first way besides doing all that?
You can do it different. I mean, there's other variations mentally you can do it, I guess. But they're all the same math, just in different, I guess, just different ways of thinking about it, maybe. If I were to look at the first way, though, real quick, again, when I say, okay, I'm going to do x1 plus x2 over 2, that's going to equal x to the midpoint. Like, look, I'm not even touching the board and it's doing that. Like, I'm away from the board. Touching, you can hear it. Away, and it was doing that. My goodness. I don't know. Okay, so I fill these in. This is my midpoint. This was my endpoint. -2 plus my unknown endpoint over 2 equals 1. Multiply by 2 again. Start off, or 2 over 1 if you prefer. -2 plus x2 equals 2. I add 2, and x2 is 4. Is that what our other x ends up being? 4, good. Okay. Same thing with the y's. If I add the y's together, I do 2 plus y2, because 2 is the y we know, over 2. And see that's equal to the y of the midpoint, 2. I'm going to multiply by 2, multiply by 2. 2 plus y2 equals 4. Subtract 2 and subtract 2. y2 is 4, and y2 is 2, excuse me. Is that the same as it ended up being? Yeah. So it works either way. Okay? Now, you won't always have a graph, so it is important to know this other way still, okay? It's important to know that other way still good, because we won't always have a graph. All we're doing is we're taking the same midpoint formula that we used in our warm-up, and we're just filling in midpoint instead of our other endpoint. And we set the solve for a different variable. Okay. Questions on this? So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you some work time. We're actually going to skip those discussion questions. I'm going to give you some work time and to finish, to do the rest of the assignment. I assigned 1 through 8 last time, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to give you guys some work time to do 9 through 13 there. I'm going to give you some work time to do 9 through 13 there, okay? Now that we did those last couple examples. And then after some work time of that, we're going to